Okay. My name is Paolo Galliano. I am co-founder and chief scientist of Aleria. I'm actually joined by one of my colleagues today. I see Francesca Cadigaris, who is our fractional chief marketing officer, is here today. And we may have a couple of other colleagues join us as well. I'm going to start, as I do with every conversation, before I tell you about how to set DEI targets without reverse discrimination, I always like to start by addressing what I jokingly call the white elephant in the room, and that's me. And specifically, what is a white male cisgender heterosexual guy with no disabilities and every ounce of privilege in the world doing, talking to you all about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And in a nutshell, I've been in this field for about 9 years. I came into it through a very unusual path. I'm an immigrant, but I've been here for more than 40 years, so that hardly counts. But I remember when I first came, encountering some issues with racial disparities that really stuck with me, and I always was very curious on the personal level about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And my career evolved first in academia and then as a consultant, and I was always looking at the link between individuals and the societal context in which they operated from an analytical perspective. And one day I was sitting in a session. I used to go to all these sessions about how do you get more people of color into leadership roles, how do you get more women in technology. And I was always struck by that distinction between, or I should say the contrast between the individual experiences that people shared of what happened to them because of their skin color, because of their gender, on the one hand. And on the other hand, when it came to solutions, we talked about these vague things like, let's change the hearts and minds of corporate America. Let's remove structural barriers. And as I sat there in that session, mulling over, how do you ever close the gap between the two? I thought, wait a second, this is exactly what I've been doing for my entire career, first as a professor, and then as a consultant and entrepreneur. And so I literally dropped everything I was doing. This, again, was in late 2015. I started to build these computer simulations, of which you will see a very simple example during the talk, and convinced myself that I was onto something really powerful. And I thought that there was an opportunity to show people who look like me how they can actually benefit financially for their organizations by becoming more equitable, more inclusive, and more diverse. So with that, I jumped into this work, and I'm going to show you today. What you're going to see is, for those of you that have been to one of our webinars before, some of the themes will be familiar. I'm bringing together content from a variety of webinars, and then there's going to be some entirely new content that kind of brings it all together and gives you what I think is a very powerful perspective on how to really rethink the way that we set not just DEI targets, but in general, how we do targeting and how do we run DEI as a key part of every organization. I do want to make one super quick announcement. I have to say this, I'm just very proud. I gave a TEDx talk on some of the basic ideas on measuring inclusion, which is one element of what we do. I gave that in October at TEDx Harlem, and we just found out this week they actually decided to choose that as one of the feature talks on the main TED site. So if you go to TED.com today, you will see under the newest talk section, you will actually see my picture, and you will see a video. It's about a 13-minute video, no slides. It really just talks about the ideas behind measuring inclusion and why it's so important to do that. So I just kind of wanted to brag about that. It's not every day that, I always wanted to be a TED speaker, and, now we've kind of achieved that. So I want to then start out by doing 3 polls, actually. It's 1 poll, but it's got 3 different questions. And I would like it if you indulge me for a second. I'm going to start the first poll in a second. And they all have to do with about how people set DEI targets. And in the first one, and I'm going to launch it in a second, I'm going to ask you to think about, when setting diversity targets for an organization, which of the following pools should be the guide in choosing meaningful representation levels. And you can choose one of these 4 ideas. Should we set diversity targets based on national demographics, local demographics, talent pool demographics, or customer demographics? And let me see if I can actually start by poll. I have to find polls and quizzes. And here we go. So I'm going to launch this one. So you should be seeing question number 1. Actually, it may, just so that I can, if somebody can unmute themselves and tell me, are you seeing 1 question or 3 questions? Francesca, do you see 1 question or 3?
2.
I'm sorry?
In 2 questions.
2 questions. Okay, there should be 3 questions.
Well, actually, we are seeing them. Okay, we are seeing also the 3rd one. There's a scroll down.
Okay,
yes,
great. So you have to scroll down. So the first question asks you about how we should set diversity targets, whether they should be based on the country in which you operate, the city in which you operate, whether you should look at, let's say that 10% of all graduates in a certain field are African American. Should we match that field, or should it be based on the customer demographic? The second question is about, where do you apply those? when you set diversity targets, at which level of the organization should they be applied? Should they be applied at the level of the entire organization, at the level of any major division or business unit, maybe should be based on the location or office, or should be based on the function or area like marketing, sales, or maybe even farther down. Maybe every department, every team should have DEI targets. And then the third element of that is about identity. When we're going to set targets, one of the questions, and in this particular one, you can actually choose multiple ones. You can choose as many as you want. What identity traits should we be focusing on in order to have meaningful targets that we're tracking? Should we look at race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability status, age, veteran status, and which other ones? And maybe choose whatever, your top three or all of them if you feel like there should be all of them. And so let me give you a minute, and I'll be curious to see, I'm going to be watching here, see what everybody is doing. So far, only about 4 people have responded, but let's give it another minute, and then I'll explain why I'm asking you these questions. So, okay, so good. So right now we have 9 people that have replied to the first poll, to the first question in the poll, and it looks like the second question, everybody's answering as well. Okay, good. So we have about 10 people. Okay, so let me go ahead and kind of end the poll, and it looks like we have about a dozen people now. So let me end the poll and let me share the results, right? So hopefully you can see the results on the screen. And what we see is that for the target setting, we have about 50% suggest local demographics, 15% suggest national demographics, 23% suggest talent pool demographics, and only about 8% customer demographics. Then when we look at the diversity targets, we see that most people seem to think, about 2/3 seem to think that the entire organization should be the right level to set the target. Some people think it should be at the major division or business unit, some people location office, and a few people down to the department or team level. And then lastly, when it comes to what diversity identity groups we should use, then you can see that it looks like pretty much most everybody agrees that race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age should be there. We also have 3/4 of the people think veteran status, and only about, well, and 55% of the people indicate other traits. Now, what is interesting is that I've run this poll on LinkedIn, and I ran it 2 different times. In fact, what I ran only the first one, which was about the demographics. And what you find is that there is a lot of inconsistency. Sometimes people say customer demographics, sometimes they say national demographics, and so on and so forth. And when we look at the identity traits, we clearly see that there is a sense that we should include all of these identities and maybe some other ones. And when it comes to the level, it seems like most people are suggesting at the level of the entire organization. Now, what I'm going to discuss with you today is the fact that actually all of these decisions are actually problematic. And in fact, I'm going to argue that none of them is correct. I'm going to argue that the whole idea of setting targets on the basis of diversity at any of those levels is actually not a correct idea, and it's actually a very dangerous thing to do. And let me explain what I mean by that. And by the way, and then I will actually tell you a different way to set targets, and I will explain why those ideas for a different way to set targets is actually more powerful. So hold on one second, because I have this little pop-up that's very annoying. Well, it'll come up again. Okay, so let's start and explain why I think that there are some problems. First of all, the criteria that we're selecting can actually create internal conflicts. What, for example, if you operate in multiple locations? And what if the demographics in those locations are very different? What if you have different functions that are operating at different locations? What if you have an office in Atlanta, Georgia, and an office in, I don't know, somewhere in Maine, in Bangor, Maine? What if you're developing multiple products for different target markets? What do you do? This is kind of like a hypothetical example. What if you're selling a product that targets a specific target, for example, golf clubs, which tend to target primarily white men, not exclusively, but primarily. But what if you're doing in Hawaii, where only 10% of the population identifies as white? And you can see how no matter what target you choose, there will be situations where a particular target makes no sense, and another target may make more sense in some situations, but not in others. And you can actually have conflicting results depending on how you set it. Then there is also another problem. So that's about the criteria that you set. But then we asked the second question was about application. Well, frankly, once you get below about 1,000 people, setting meaningful diversity targets is virtually impossible. Why is that? Well, because first of all, changes in diversity can take a long time. And secondly, changes in diversity depend on a ton of different factors. And most managers, even senior managers, have extremely little control over the actual diversity of their teams. It has to do with things with the economy. It has to do with the local situation. It has to do with how recruiting is being done. And again, if you have fewer than about 1,000 people, I mean, how do you do 3% of 100 people? It becomes virtually impossible to do that. And this brings up another point, which is the third issue, which is the different identity traits. That can easily lead you down a rabbit hole. What do I mean by that? Well, even if you just have, let's say, 5 buckets, right? Race and ethnicity, let's say that we combine those two, gender identity, sexual orientation, whether or not you have a disability, and maybe age. Well, and even if you only have 4 choices for each of those buckets, which is ridiculous because like race and ethnicity alone, most companies tend to have at least maybe half a dozen and more. What's going to happen is that you're going to have at least 20 to 30 to potentially 50 different buckets. And so even if you have 1,000 people, you end up with teeny tiny little sample sizes. And controlling each of them becomes incredibly difficult. And if you start to think about intersectionality, forget it. Because now you get literally an exponential explosion in the number of possible buckets that you're creating. No matter how you choose, you also have the problem that someone will always feel left out. The idea, to me, being married to a woman from Uzbekistan, which is part of Central Asia, which is much more like Turkey than, let's say, Korea or Japan or Taiwan or India, those are all Asia. Okay, so the idea that you're going to label somebody as Asia is kind of ridiculous. I don't know how many of you knew that if you are from the Middle East, in most places you're counted as being part of Europe. You count as white. So these are all things that create a massive paradox. We all want our identities to be recognized, but we also don't want to be treated as a universal representative of our group. We all have individual experiences, individual desires that shape the way that we are and the way that we work. So these are all very practical problems why trying to set DEI targets at the level of a company is a massive headache. But it turns out that there is a much bigger problem, and that is the other elephant in the room, and that is the backlash that we're experiencing against DEI. And I'm going to suggest, and by the way, I've been talking about this for many years now, that the backlash is actually very much due to the fact that we've been focusing on setting diversity targets. And I will explain that in more detail, but I'm going to give you a couple of very simple thought experiments to understand why setting targets based on diversity and trying to set them, to actually manipulate the overall diversity is a mistake. The first example, which many of you have probably heard me speak about before, is the idea that when most companies think about increasing diversity, they focus primarily on recruitment. Even though we know that diversity has an influence on your ability to retain talent, on your productivity and innovation, and on your reputation, what a lot of organizations do, unfortunately, is to focus on recruiting more people from diverse backgrounds. Lo and behold, we hire a bunch of young Black kids from an engineering school, and now we've increased our level of diversity. But then these kids go into the company and find out that their managers does not know how to deal with them, their leadership looks very different from them, and people get up and move away from them in the cafeteria, so they leave. And when they leave, they have a negative impact on retention, which impacts productivity because now the company has to go post a new job, interview people, hire people, onboard people, and it creates a bad reputation internally because the leadership will say, see, we tried it with those people, but it didn't work out. But externally, because those people will go to their friends and say, don't go work there, which actually has a negative impact on your ability to recruit. So what you're doing is you're shooting yourself in the foot because you're trying to fix the symptoms. And again, I think a lot of you have heard me talk about what I call my thermostat analogy that advises that we should not try to fix the lack of diversity by fixing the symptoms and simply hiring diverse candidates. And this analogy that I mentioned, the thermostat, is to imagine that I come in one day in the wintertime and it's really cold, and I say, oh, I know how to fix it, and I light a match under the thermostat. The temperature reading goes up, but meanwhile, the windows are open, the front door is drafty, and the roof is leaking, and I might burn the house down. And in fact, where this actually leads more specifically to reverse discrimination complaints and to the backlash that we're seeing is because of the fact that actually, if you take that literally, if you focus on diversity targets, you are unavoidably creating a form of reverse discrimination. And all you have to do is think about a hypothetical company and imagine that the company has 1,000 employees, like we were saying before, and imagine that the company has 20%, currently 20% of employees who identify as white women, 5% identify as women of color, 5% as men of color, the remaining 70% as white men. It looks like that bar that you see in the chart on your right. And imagine that now the CEO and the chief diversity officers decide that they're going to set new targets of 30% women, white women, 8% women of color, 8% men of color. And they believe that because diversity is so great, the company is going to grow by 20%. Everybody's happy. The pie is getting bigger, right? Well, not so fast. In most situations, no matter what numbers you choose, you're going to find that unless you have massive growth, in order to achieve those targets, you're going to have to increase those three, but you're going to increase the number of people in those three underrepresented, underappreciated groups at the expense of white men. You're going to have to get rid of white men. And if you're a white man, it's reverse discrimination. This is the kind of argument that was used by the Supreme Court to overturn affirmative action. But the problem is that the entire argument is flawed because it's focusing on the wrong problem. It's focusing on the outcome, on the symptom. And one way to see that is to look at the data from McKinsey and Lean In, and I'm using the same colors on purpose because these are the ones that McKinsey and Lean In is using, in which they show that at the entry level across all organizations in the US, white men make up only about 34% of the company. White women, 29%, women of color and men of color, 18% each. As they advance through the organization, look at what happens. The representation of white men increases by 23 percentage points to 57% of the company, while the same percentage is lost by the other groups. And Black women, women of color in general, suffer the most, where they lose 12% of their representation as they go from entry level to C-suite. So the problem is that it's a leaky bucket. We're losing people from the organization. We're losing talent. And pouring more water in from the top is just going to make more of a mess on the table. So we need to learn to stop fixing the symptoms and actually fix the cause. We are fighting water with fire, and it's creating massive problems. The fundamental problem, and again, some of these themes may be familiar to you as I'm bringing in things from different topics that I've talked about, is that even though we talk about DE&I, virtually every study and all of the metrics that we use for progress are focused on diversity alone. And that is a real problem. And by the way, I mentioned that I've been talking about this for a long time. I recently went back and realized that I wrote an article in 2018. It was in April of 2018, in which I said the continued push for diversity can lead to backlash from members of the privileged majority who feel that their companies discriminated against them. And the backlash can propagate to entire industries and in some cases, even to society as a whole, as evidenced by recent attacks on affirmative action. That was in 2018. That was 2 years before George Floyd. 2 years, 1 month, and 23 days to be exact. So it was fairly prescient, right? Well, it turns out that it's fairly obvious when you think about it that way, but it turns out that there's also a very elegant solution for how to work around that. And the way to do that is that you learn to measure inclusion and equity in addition to diversity. And then you need to understand how all three of these D, E, and I measures can contribute to what I call higher profits and happier people. How do you make a more successful organization in which people actually are happy to work, they're productive, they want to be there? And in order to do that, I'm going to give you our definitions of inclusion, equity, and diversity as follows. We think that from the point of view of an organization, inclusion is about what you do, diversity is about what you get, and equity is what you want. And in order to explain that, I'm going to show you some of the science behind my work that shows with a computer simulation what happens in an organization when you're not being inclusive, how that impacts both the diversity and the performance of the company. Some of you have seen the simulation. This is a very simple company that has 4 layers from entry-level managers, VPs, and executives. In particular, in this company, there are only 2 kinds of people. Yellow represent women, blue represent men. I'm not suggesting that gender is binary. We could capture any kind of diversity here, but we're trying to make a point that you will see in a moment. Under normal circumstances, when I run the simulation, as you can see here, some of the people are promoted. You see them floating up. Some turn gray and disappear. They're the ones that are either quitting or being terminated from the company. But no matter how long you run the simulation, you find that the company always stays roughly 50-50 at every level. What happens, we asked, if we now introduce a form of exclusion within this kind of organization that is manifested itself in the way that people are promoted? So what happens if, when it comes time to promote people, If you are a man, if you're blue, you get a slight leg up against women. Not that it ever happens in real companies, right? But what if the cumulative result of all of the forms of exclusion that are happening within the company are giving men an advantage in being promoted? Let's look at the same simulation. We start again at 50-50. We introduce one bias that is uniform across all the levels. We run for the equivalent of 5 years, and lo and behold, we end up with a company that is dramatically imbalanced, in this case, in terms of gender. So what we have just shown is that changing the level of inclusion changes the level of diversity. And in fact, we have been able to simulate the level of diversity, again, from the McKinsey and Lean-In data. And you can see here at 4, so these are like the 4 layers of the company. Again, yellow is women, blue is men. And we're showing in retail, banking, and engineering. And for each pair of bars, we have the data from McKinsey and Lean-In is the upper bar, and the simulation is the lower bar. And you can see that we can match with a very high degree of accuracy the profiles of all of these companies. So we know that inclusion drives diversity. What about the inclusion driving performance? Because I argue that it also drives performance. Well, the way to see that is that in the simulation, we can track the level of satisfaction of the employees, and we can see that whenever somebody gets passed over for promotion, meaning that somebody junior to them gets promoted before they do, their satisfaction will dip a little bit. It will come back up, but if it happens repeatedly, it will accumulate. And here what we see is the overall level of satisfaction of the men who are getting promoted. They're happy, they think this is great. And the women. And the women are not happy because they're getting passed over for promotion. And what that means is that they're going to produce less because they're less satisfied, and they're going to be more likely to leave your company. And that is why I've said earlier that equity is what you want. Because if you have this situation and you have people that just by virtue of being treated less well than men, or for the same thing would happen with race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or gender identity, anything, you are going to lose money whenever you see that there is an inequity, because the people that are treated less well will actually produce less and they will stick around less. And I invite you to go to our website where you can find a calculator that actually puts numbers for any organization of any size as to how much money they're losing because of reduced productivity and reduced retention rates. So if you buy all of that, what we need to understand now is how do you measure inclusion and how do you measure equity? Again, measuring inclusion, I've given entire webinars on this. I'm going to give you just a very, very thumbnail sketch of how we do that. And the realization is that the reason why, or one of the reasons why nobody really seems to know how to measure inclusion is because inclusion itself is invisible. And I've given oftentimes the analogy between inclusion and health, in which I talk about the fact that you tend to notice when you're healthy, but not when you're sick. When I introduced myself, I didn't say, I'm sorry, the other way around. You tend to notice when you're sick more than you notice when you're healthy. When I introduced myself, I didn't say, hi, I'm Paolo, I'm very healthy. But if I had been coughing because of COVID or I had lost my voice, I would have said something about it. And inclusion works the same way. We tend to notice inclusion when we don't have it. In other words, we tend to notice exclusion. Now, one interesting corollary is that just as healthy people tend not to know a lot about diseases, the people that are most included tend not to know about exclusion, which I think is one of the biggest reasons why leadership often does not embrace DEI, because they just don't see the problem. But the medical analogy also helped us to understand that we can look for symptoms just the way that doctors look for symptoms to identify a disease. And what we ended up doing was to create a set of categories that reflect the kind, think of these as like the vascular system, the muscular system, the skeletal system, the neural system, right? The endocrinological system. These are the main things that happen to you in the workplace that impact your ability to succeed at work and therefore your satisfaction. So we measure inclusion by measuring effectively exclusion, by asking people to tell us situations where they were unable to perform at their peak in the workplace, and then to categorize it this way. Because we know that those things are what make up your satisfaction at work. And the key where we link satisfaction and inclusion is that to the extent that different people have different experiences because of their personal characteristics, they will have different levels of satisfaction. So from the point of view of the company, inclusion is a reflection of, are we treating everybody in a way that they can have the same kinds of experiences and the same kinds of opportunities in the company? In addition to understanding this category, we also need to understand what is causing these things to happen. So here you are in your company, but things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because of some policies in the workplace, or because of your leadership or your management, your HR department, your peers, sometimes even your reports or people outside the company, like your customers, your partners, your suppliers. So when we collect data, we ask people about the experiences, the category of the experiences, and the source of the experiences. And the kind of data that we get is incredibly powerful because we get the stories that tell us about exactly what is happening and the data that tells us where to look. For example, we can rank the categories and find the categories that have the biggest amount of exclusion. In this particular data set, respect is a very big problem with companies. And when you go look at the specific experiences tied to respect, you find that people don't get invited to meetings, or they get interrupted, or people steal their ideas, or they simply are treated rudely within the organization. You can then find out, well, what's causing that? Well, we find that in most organizations, it's people, not policies. It's leadership, management, and peers that are universally the main sources of things that happen to us in the workplace that make us feel uncomfortable. And when we collect also identity data, which we do, we can drill down and look for identity-based disparities to understand who is impacted. So here, for example, from a recent study where we looked at the field of cybersecurity across dozens of companies, we found that in general, there's a huge gender disparity in the treatment of women versus treatment of men. At the overall level, we find that the level of exclusion of women is 2 times higher than men. And when we drill down to individual categories, we see that sometimes the disparity is as much as 4.5 times higher levels of exclusion for women than for men. And we can use the same idea to look, for example, at intersectionality, where we look at the collection of different aspects of your identity, whether it's your race, your ethnicity, and we ask ourselves, how much of an impact does it have on you, on your level of exclusion, if you will, as a function of how different you are from the normative majority, a white, male, cisgender, heterosexual person with no disabilities. And when we do that, we see a very strong relationship between the level of intersectionality and the level of exclusion that you experience. And all of this matches incredibly well with retention rates, satisfaction rates, feelings of belonging, and things of that sort. So focusing on inclusion, which is the first key that we add to the D, we add the inclusion, has the benefit that instead of looking at an indirect measure like diversity, you're looking at a real-time measure. You're placing experiences into buckets instead of placing people into buckets and making them feel differently. Instead of having to focus on, oh, it's Pride Month this month. Okay, let's focus on LGBTQ. In February was Black History Month, and then it was Women's Month, and then it was, instead of doing that, you're actually benefiting all the excluded groups, because inclusion really is showing how you can grow the pie for everybody, which means that you're also getting rid of that zero-sum game mindset. So how do we use inclusion to set targets? It's actually very easy. You identify disparities in the level of inclusion, and then you fix the underlying problems. So you go beyond simply measuring diversity, you measure inclusion, and you understand how the experiences of individuals are different for different groups. Now, where this will be most new for most of you, even if you've seen me talk about inclusion before, is that it turns out that you can also measure equity. And I've given a talk specifically on measuring equity, and I'm going to give you a summary, and then I will bring together all 3 of these and show you how you can completely revolutionize the way that we do DEI within organizations by looking at all 3 of these at the same time and how you should do that. So let's look at equity. When I talk about equity, I talk about biases, and I point out that we have a tendency to focus on unconscious biases, and that's what I would call individual biases, right? Unconscious biases, in fact, sometimes they can be very conscious. If somebody uses a racial slur against you or a sexist remark, that's really unlikely to be unconscious, right? But we're talking about individual biases. It's biases that result, or it's experiences that are resulting from either conscious or unconscious biases that influence interactions between people. And an example might be a white male manager that tends to assign the more interesting projects to white male employees. At the opposite end of the spectrum, there are contextual biases. So these are factors external to the organization that create biases towards certain groups. For example, suppose that a corporate leader who wants to do some recruiting is invited to speak at an event. Well, if that event happens to cater mostly to white men, there is a contextual bias that is not the CEO's fault, the corporate leader's fault, but it is nonetheless a bias. In between is what I think are the most interesting and the most dangerous forms of biases, which is what I call organizational biases. These are policies, processes, or systems that either create a bias or allow biases to go undetected and impact a whole bunch of people. An example of that is a policy that says that a company will only recruit from Ivy League colleges, because that is a policy that will clearly be biased because Ivy League colleges are not representative of the whole population, and therefore that's going to create a bias. And what I'm going to argue with you in the context of equity is that organizational biases are by far the worst, because they allow individual biases to impact large numbers of individuals. And let me use an example from the news. This is actually from a few years ago. This was an article about a lawsuit against one of the Tesla factories. And there was a quote in here where this gentleman, Aaron Craven, who was one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, mentioned that when he clocked into work every day at the Tesla Fremont factory, he knew that he might hear or be called the N-word. And he talks about other horrible things that were happening. Now, that cost Tesla millions and millions of dollars, and they still have problems with these kinds of issues. And this highlights the differences between individual and organizational biases. The individual bias, which by the way, in this case was clearly not unconscious, was Aaron Craven's manager calling him the N-word. That caused Aaron to feel disrespect during his work. The organizational bias actually allowed these exclusionary behaviors to impact large numbers of people. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting in that article is that Tesla gives a very misguided reply. There is a senior manager at Tesla or an executive that says, well, our company has more than 10,000 employees in the Fremont factory alone. So it is not humanly possible to stop all bad conduct. They're assuming that the problem is individual behaviors. But that's not the case, because the reality is that it's the organizational biases that are influencing the outcomes. And there are typically three ways that happens. The first way that can happen is that you can have a process, policy, or system that itself is biased. For example, hiring from Ivy League colleges only. The second situation is that you may have PPSs or process, policies, or systems that allow individual biases to impact outcomes for multiple individuals. For example, if your interview process is very casual, or if your performance review processes are very casual, because if they're not highly structured, it allows biases to creep in. But the third kind, which is the more thorny kind, is like what happened to Tesla. It's the lack of a policy or a process or a system that would block those biases. Tesla should have had a policy that if a manager was accused of calling somebody the N-word, they should be put on warning. And if it happened again, they should just be fired. So it was the lack of a policy that created an organizational biases at Tesla, and it does so in many other organizations. So how do we measure this? And how do we detect it? Well, when we talked about inclusion, I suggested that what you should do is to measure experiences of individuals, what happens day in and day out. In terms of biases at the organizational level for equity, I suggest that what you do is you look for disparities in outcomes. So if you take any policy, any process, any system, whether it could be a software system that is not accessible to certain people, it could be a process, it could be a policy that is only available to certain people on-site instead of off-site. Look at all of the people that are going in through this process and look at who comes out of it. And to the extent that you see any unequal outcomes, it means that you have biases in your policy, your process, or your system. And the analogy here between what I told you about inclusion and what I'm telling you about equity is that at the organizational level, this helps us to understand the different definition of equity, which says that if you have any disparities in outcomes on the basis of identity traits that have nothing to do with the ability of people to get their work done, then it means that there is a lack of equity. And here's what's beautiful about this. You want an easy target? Make sure that all of your inequities go to zero. Think about it, right? You're telling people, measure your processes, look at who goes in and who comes out. And if you see any disparities, try to understand why there is a bias and try to fix it. And we want to see those inequities to go to zero. Nobody's going to feel upset that you want to drive inequities to zero. Just like nobody's going to feel upset that you want to make everybody feel included. I'm not saying drive inequities to zero for Black people, for lesbians, for people with a mobility impairment. I'm saying apply both measuring inclusion and measuring equity to the entire organization. And it turns out that focusing on equity has a number of additional benefits that are very different from the benefits of inclusion. One of the things is that it helps you to understand at a very granular level the causes of the disparities. Maybe you are the person who manages the mentorship program in your company. Track it, not just like how many people go in and come out, but who applies, how long does it take to get assigned, how satisfied are they with it. Maybe you manage promotions in your department. Maybe you simply manage who gets assigned projects. All of those processes can be easily measured to understand what may be creating disparities. And the great part is that if you're a manager, what do? Well, you have some processes or policies or systems that you control, and you have visibility on that. So it becomes really easy to make each manager responsible for things that they have direct control over, which means that you can hold them accountable for their equity. It's much easier to do that than to hold them accountable for diversity, which is a much more difficult thing that is outside of the control. And more importantly, if you've been reading a lot about DEI, you may know that managers are kind of a linchpin, and they're the ones that really complain about it, because often the leadership will say, oh, here are the targets for you. And a lot of times those targets are actually counter to what they're trying to do. For example, oh, pay level has to be the same for everybody. Well, if I'm a manager and I'm using compensation as a motivator to promote better behavior, and you're telling me that I can't do that, that goes against what I'm trying to do. If you tell me that I have to focus about DEIB training and all these things and interferes with my ability to do my work, or it means that I have more stuff on my plate that I have to do, it's very difficult. But in this case, you're showing me how I can actually make things better for my team, which is going to make my performance better. It's going to make me look better. And it turns out that this is actually a relatively easy way, or a relatively easy thing to embed in every process, policy, and system in this company. And I'm coming toward a close, and I'm going to tell you exactly how you can embed DEI across the entire organization. And before I tell you my very, very, very simple recipe of this, I want to take a step back, and I want to talk about, and I'm very candid sometimes. I've been writing, I have a book coming out soon. I'll tell you about it in a moment. I find that we in the DEI space make frequent mistakes that end up either causing complaints or reverse discrimination. But in some cases, I feel that we do things that turn off CEOs, COOs, the leadership that we want to involve. We sometimes say things that inadvertently turns them off. And there's one thing that I hear all the time, that if I never hear one of these sentences again, I will be a very happy person. And there are statements along these lines. DEI is not a sprint, it's a marathon. DEI is not easy. You have to spend a lot of time and effort on it. The journey is really difficult, but think of the destination. DEI is something that after you do it here, you have to do it in every part of the organization. If you are the leader of a company and you hear that, you are freaking out. Because what you're basically telling me is, I need to do something. I don't know how well it's going to have an impact. I'm using a measurement that takes years to change and that I have very little control over. And now you're telling me that I have to repeat the same thing. And also my white guys are all complaining about this. And now you're telling me that I have to take the same thing and do it in every part of my company. And when you put it that way, it sounds horribly difficult, horribly difficult. The reality is that it doesn't have to be. In fact, I'm going to suggest to you that there is a much, much better approach in which you think of DEI the way that you think of finance. And this is something that none of you have heard before, because it's the very first time. Most of these slides now are new. Let me give you a very simple analogy, and I'll dive into the details of what I mean. DEI, not coincidentally, are three core pillars of what we need to do when we manage personnel. And it turns out that they match really neatly three core elements of how companies manage their finance. And what I'm going to argue with you, and I'm going to give you details on each one of these, is that inclusion is like cash flow. Equity is like your profit and loss or income statement, and diversity is your balance sheet. And once you give this analogy to your leaders, their light bulb will go off, and you will be grateful, and they will be grateful. So let me go into and explain what I mean by that. Inclusion is your cash flow. I don't know how many of you are familiar with corporate finance, but the cash flow statement is a statement that tells you about everything that the organization is doing within a short time frame that is either generating cash or using cash. And it helps you to understand how the organization's operations are running. In an analogous fashion, inclusion tells you about all the day-to-day experiences that influence each employee's ability to do their work and therefore there increases and decreases in their level of satisfaction, which in turn are directly linked to the productivity and retention levels, which is why inclusion to me is very much like cash flow. It's kind of an instantaneous, real-time measurement of what is happening, what is good and what is not so good. Equity is like profit and loss. If you look at a P&L statement, it provides an overview of revenues, expenses, and net income over a range of time. And the purpose of it is to show the profitability of business activities, and it is useful to track changes in financial performance over time as operations and market conditions change. By the way, these are definitions from Investopedia or whatever, these are standardized definitions. What about equity? Well, as I just explained to you, equity is about tracking the outcomes of people interacting with the organizations, people or processes, policies, and systems over a range of time. You can't measure outcomes in 1 second or in 1 day. You have to look at it over, let's say, a quarter or half a year or 3 months or 2 months or whatever the case might be. And the purpose of that is to identify potential disparities and monitor how they change over time in response to changes in workplace and market conditions. It's exactly like your P&L. It's the overall, how is your company, how are different pieces of your company doing in contributing to the overall well-being and the overall success of the company. And lastly, diversity is your balance sheet. The balance sheet is a snapshot in time that provides information about the organization's current mixture of assets, equity, and liabilities that result from everything that you do in the organization. Diversity is a snapshot in time of the current mixture of human assets in your organization, which results from all the things that happen in the organization that influence recruitment and retention. Now, when you see it this way, it makes you realize that some of the things that we've been thinking about are really profoundly misguided. When we focus on diversity alone, it's like asking the CFO to run a company using only the balance sheet. And you can't do that. Try to do that. Try to go to a CFO and say, would you like to run the company with just the balance sheet? Here's a snapshot of where we are. You figure it out. Well, we need more money. We don't have enough money in the bank. We need more money. Tell all the managers to make more money. And that's all you're telling them to do. At the same time, this tells you about the problem with this kind of top-down setting these targets is because similarly, you would not ask every manager throughout the organization to calculate their own balance sheet. The balance sheet is something that only the company, or maybe sometimes the biggest divisions, right? But the balance sheet is something that typically the top level, the top brass uses to understand the overall state of well-being of the organization, and diversity is the same way. But the other thing is that, would you hold managers accountable to make sure that they all achieve exactly the same financial objectives? I don't know any company that takes an approach other than let's set the overall targets and make sure that everybody's following those targets. And that makes zero sense. Zero. It's like saying, here's the balance sheet for the company. We want everybody to have exactly the same level of equity, liabilities and assets. And another thing that's interesting is that I sometimes have been criticized when I first started to do this work, when I talked about inclusion, say, well, we don't want to forget diversity. We don't want you to focus too much on inclusion because that takes the focus away on diversity. To me, that means that there is a profound lack of understanding of what diversity, inclusion, and equity mean, or the definitions of them are such that they cannot be linked together. Because it's like saying, I want to teach you about the P&L, and you're saying, well, that means that you don't want to use the balance sheet. We need to use all three, but we need to understand how each of them is contributing to the success of the organization. We need to understand who should be responsible for it. We need to understand how to set these targets. And what I'm going to give you to wrap up in the last 5 minutes is a very, very simple recipe. And we've already seen how we can measure inclusion, how we can measure equity. And so really, the first part of the recipe is that you need to measure what matters, where it matters. So measure inclusion at the level of employees. Why? Because that is telling you what is impacting the day-to-day fluctuations in satisfaction of your employees and how you can fix those issues. At the manager level, you want to measure equity because it's the managers that are impacting the most people through their control of policies, processes, and systems. And when I say manager, I'm being very general. It can be the COO that sets a corporate-wide policy. It could be the CHRO that sets a policy for leave and whatever, flex time or remote work and things of that sort, but it could also be literally a manager of a small team of 5 who's deciding who gets which clients or who gets which projects. And measure at each level what each manager is responsible for, track it, and look for biases and hold them accountable for it. And then you measure diversity at the level of the entire organization. And you try to understand where there are disparities and why those disparities are there. And what that will do is that it will create a completely different role for DEI. And this is my personal hope for what will happen to DEI. Now, what you can do as a DEI function, and it should really become a function, a top-level function in every organization, is that the role of the DEI function should be to establish processes and tools for regular collection and review of inclusion data. It should establish processes and tools for the managers to collect and report equity data for all the processes that they own. And then it should establish metrics and policies to hold the managers and the individual contributors accountable for what they're doing, and ensure that diversity data is being collected where needed, because you can't just collect it when you first hire people and then lose track of it throughout the organization. And then as a DEI, just like the financial department rolls everything up to the top level to create the balance sheet, you should roll up all the DEI data to support the executive decision-making. And lastly, and this is something that we've been able to show with inclusion data, is to link the data, whether it's E or I in particular, to finance through the impact that they have on productivity and churn. And it turns out there are other ways that you can measure financial impact, for example, in terms of risk of lawsuits, audits, and things of that sort. So as an additional set of reflections, and then we're done, if you do this properly, it should not be difficult. This is something that should become as standardized as tracking expenses or sale processes. Would you ever imagine your manager saying, I'm sorry, I don't feel like tracking expenses? What would you do to a manager that's doing that? It should be exactly the same way, but you need to make it easy for them. It needs to become a part and parcel of everything that they do. Accountability will be a lot easier to enforce, and it will be a lot more fair, because now you're measuring accountability for things over which they have direct control, and it's their responsibility. That means that DEI will automatically be embedded in every part of the organization, not because you have to go and like slap people on the head in every department, but because you will create a set of tools and processes and metrics and accountability policies that will be universal and will be very, very easy at that point to apply by everybody. And here's the key. If you do that, DEI will become the single most valuable strategic function of every organization. And that's because many of you have seen this slide before. If you look at how much money companies in the United States in 1 year spend on advertising, it is 1/30 of what we spend on payroll. Human assets are by far the most expensive budget item of every company and the most valuable asset. If we can unlock the value of human assets by treating DEI as a corporate function that is measurable and that can hold people accountable, we will completely revolutionize our economy. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this little fire and brimstone talk about my big vision of how we can do all of these things together. My book is coming out in September now. The book only talks about, it talks about inclusion. We don't really talk about the equity side at all. That will be the next book. But it turns out that you can pre-order if you want to, but if you would like to, when we send you a follow-up email, we will also send you a link to a free excerpt from the book and a discount code that you will be able to use when the book comes out. And you'll also get a link to today's recording. It will take us a few days to do that. I also want to point out that we organize an annual conference called the Diversity and Inclusion Research Conference. We just announced that we're joining forces with another conference called DISM, which is I don't even remember, it's the D&I Service Management Forum, which has to do with setting DI standards at the corporate level. And you can kind of see now why we're so interested in joining forces with them. And we're going to be giving a talk actually on June 25th, in which the organizers of DISM and myself, who have been chairing and organizing DIRC for about 7 years now, will be talking about why we're joining forces. So I'm going to leave 10 minutes for questions. I know there was at least one comment in the chat, but I want to thank you for your attention. And I will look through the chat, but also there is not a very large group. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves and wants to make any comments or questions, you're more than welcome to do so right now. So thank you. Hope you enjoyed this.